Over 5,000 years ago, in the Tyrolean Alps, a tough, veteran hunter started out on the last journey he would ever take. After climbing from the high meadows into a rocky pass between two mountains, he was shot in the back with an arrow. The flint arrowhead severed his subclavian artery and he swiftly bled to death. As he lay in terrible agony in this bitterly cold high place, his murderer approached and yanked out the arrow shaft. As the murderer walked away and the victim breathed his last breath, a biting wind howled across the mountainside. A heavy snowfall would soon cover his body, freezing him here amongst the rocks. Eventually, his burial place would be covered by a glacier, and there he would remain for 5,200 years, his freeze-dried body, clothes and belongings protected from decomposition. And after his accidental discovery by hikers in 1991, he became a media sensation and was given the nickname Ötzi after the Ötzi Alps where he was found. This mummy is now one of the most famous archaeological finds in the world. Since then, his body and the artifacts found with him have been subject to intense study by scientists in many fields. Their work has enabled the life of this man to be reconstructed in unprecedented detail. X-rays, CT scans, DNA testing, and microscopic examinations have revealed this man's age and physical condition, his ancestry, and his array of medical conditions. We know from his stomach contents what he ate in his final hours, and we know from the particles of pollen on his clothes the kinds of environments he was in, enabling his final journey to be reconstructed. Organic material that, in almost all other circumstances, would have rotted to nothing, was preserved almost perfectly, enabling the reconstruction of his clothing, tools, and the gear he needed for life in the Alps, like his firemaking and medical kits. Thanks to his sudden freezing in this remote spot, we understand the sophisticated knowledge and skill that Ötzi and his people had over these materials that do not usually survive. For example, the different kinds of wood for his bow, arrows, and knife handle. The animal hides and furs from different species, each with its own properties suited to its task. The fungi, mosses, and leaves he carried for practical and medicinal purposes, and even the grass lining of his shoes that he used for comfort and insulation. He lived in a period of great change. For millennia, his Neolithic ancestors had grown crops and herded animals in Europe, felling trees and exploiting a range of environments. But they had done all this with tools of stone. By Ötzi's lifetime, people were beginning to use a new material that would change the world. He carried an object that epitomizes the Chalcolithic era, a beautiful copper axe. But great change was coming again. Already during his lifetime, on the European steppe to the east, herders of cattle and horses were bringing changes that would soon sweep westwards, transforming Europe forever. So what can this unprecedented level of preservation tell us about not only Ötzi the Tyrolean Iceman, but the world that he came from? So who was this man that we call Ötzi? How did he meet his end? Was he murdered? Did he die in battle? Or was he perhaps a human sacrifice? Well, he was probably born around 3300 BC to 3100 BC, and he grew up in the Italian Alps. He died when he was about 45 years old, not very far from where he was raised, but higher up at an elevation of 3,210 meters, over 10,000 feet. Researchers believe he died in the late spring, when the mountains would have still been thick with snow, and he was quite well equipped for his journey. He wore a sheepskin coat or jacket. He wore shoes with bearskin and red deer leather soles, with grass uppers that formed a net around the foot. These were stuffed with grass for insulation. It's possible he used a tiny tab of fur to secure his shoes to his leggings. These leggings were made from strips of deer hide with alternating light and dark fur, presumably because it looked stylish. The leggings were attached to a kind of loincloth and belt made of goatskin, a domesticated animal. From his belt, he hung much of his equipment, and the rest he carried in a backpack or slung over his shoulder. On his head, he wore a bearskin hat, and around his shoulders he wore a woven grass cape, the ends of which were unwoven. Perhaps these loose ends had a practical purpose, making the cape more flexible, or perhaps it just looked nice fluttering in the breeze. There is some discussion on whether this item really was a cape, or if it was more of a blanket to sit on and perhaps to sleep on or under for insulation. Perhaps it was both, or neither. His gear too was well suited for travel in the mountains. He had a fire-making kit, and one of the funguses he carried was used to hold an ember. He had a very nice chert knife. Chert is just like flint, with an ash wood handle and an antler tool for retouching all of his stone tools to keep them sharp. His bow was made from yew, famously great wood for a bow. The armies of medieval England, with their feared longbowmen, used bows of yew, not English yew, however, but imported Italian yew, because it was the best that you could get. And Ötzi knew this thousands of years earlier. His bow looked rough and unfinished, and we'll talk why that might be later on. In a quiver hung over his shoulder, he carried 14 arrows with viburnum and dogwood shafts, but only 2 of them had stone arrowheads, and those 2 were on broken shafts. And of course there was his famous copper axe. The yew-wood haft is 60 centimeters or 24 inches long. At the top is a natural right-angled crook where the blade is hafted with birch tar glue and a stout leather wrapping. That blade is smaller than you might imagine, at just 9.5 centimeters or 3.7 inches long, so it would sit nicely in the palm of your hand. I'll talk more about the significance of this axe and the Copper Age generally later. What about the man himself? The tests to determine his age are considered highly accurate, so we can say he was 45 or 46 years old. They estimate he was around 160 centimeters or 5 foot 3 inches tall, and that he weighed around 110 pounds. Some suggest he may have been a bit taller and heavier, but we can't be sure because when he was found he had been essentially freeze-dried and his skin and organs had contracted enormously from their size in life. It's the difference between a grape and a raisin. A living person's body weight depends on many variables, so the estimates are just that, but it's fair to say he was not a large man. But what kind of shape was he in? Well, he certainly had a low body fat percentage. One researcher who performed a CT scan said that he had the body of an Olympic wrestler, meaning he was well muscled and lean, and this description has often been repeated. But others believe he was not quite so muscular as that, especially not on his upper body, which might have been quite scrawny, while his lower body had much more muscle mass from a lifetime of walking up and down hills and mountains. But however big his muscles were, he was certainly pretty shredded. So does that mean he was starving or suffering from malnutrition? Well, in fact, he seems to have been eating a highly nutritious diet. They can tell this by analysing certain body tissues, looking for specific chemical signatures that come from various foods. And also the preservation was so good that it even preserved his internal organs and their contents. His digestive tract actually contained food and traces of food in various stages of digestion, from his stomach to his colon. This has enabled reconstruction of not only his last meal, but an entire timeline of his final hours as he descended and ascended the mountains. Because of course, particles and chemical traces found lower down in his intestines were consumed earlier than those higher up. And along with food, he ingested other environmental particles like pollen and mosses, presumably tiny fragments stuck to his fingers and food that he didn't even notice he was eating. And these particles came from specific species that grow at certain altitudes. For example, 2 kinds of sphagnum moss that grow in lower altitudes were found. One species in his colon and another species was near his body. Both were inadvertently carried up there by him in the hours before his death, from the kind of lower altitude environments where these mosses grow. Remarkable work, really. And they have produced a detailed medical history of the man. There were plenty of medical conditions to find, and he's considered to be a man suffering quite serious pain in various parts of his body. Examination by paleopathologists specialising in examining mummies, they do a lot of their work in Egypt, unsurprisingly, revealed that this man had worn teeth with cavities and gum disease, which would have been painful or at least uncomfortable and unpleasant. He had an intestinal parasite called whipworm, which can cause abdominal pain, tiredness and diarrhea, although the extent to which he experienced these symptoms, we don't know. It is often reported that he had Lyme disease, which is an infection spread by ticks and can cause very severe symptoms. But these results have been called into question, so he might not have had it after all. Scans have suggested that he would have had pain or discomfort in his joints, especially his knees and hips, but also his shoulders and back. This joint pain might be related to the 61 tattoos on his body. These simple lines were made by incising the skin and rubbing in the soot from wood ash. They are often located where his bones and joints show damage through a lifetime of wear and tear. There are examples from modern people around the world doing similar things, tattooing for medical purposes. It's even been suggested that the ash might work not only by magic, but as an actual local painkiller or by absorbing toxins. Perhaps the therapeutic effects would wear off over time, requiring him to go back for regular treatment. His fingernails had come off, but they found 2 nearby, and those fingernails had ridges on them called Bowes lines. They say this shows that he had 3 illnesses in the last 6 months before his death, but what those illnesses were, or if they were caused by periods of hunger or from localized injuries, we don't know. And he did have injuries. He'd broken several ribs during his lifetime, and at some point his nose had been broken. Perhaps this shows he had a violent life, which I'll talk more about at the end of the video, or perhaps he was just accident prone. Genetic testing suggested he had a predisposition to arteriosclerosis, and CT scans show that he did indeed have heart disease, so clearly he wasn't in superb health. But I also think the view of him as a disease-riddled old man on his last legs is exaggerated. Life was hard back then without modern medicine, and no doubt he was feeling his age. In fact, some of the things he carried on his person, and had recently eaten, might have been intended to alleviate his symptoms. But I'm sure many pre-modern people, under the same intensity of testing, would reveal a similar array of issues. Even most of us in our middle age today, who consider ourselves in good health, would likely end up with a long list of medical conditions if we had full-body CT scans, DNA tests, and people in white coats with tweezers and microscopes going over every inch of us, inside and out. Despite all his medical issues and his small stature, I believe Ötzi would have been a hard, tough man who could certainly outwalk and probably even outfight most people around today. An enormous number of scientific tests have revealed so much about this man and his life, but many of the results of these tests have been expanded on, refuted, or contradicted by later tests. And these results themselves are of course open to interpretation, which is a huge part of archaeology. There continues to be discussion about almost every element of his body and his equipment. However, there are narratives that have been put forward about his profession or his role in his society, and also about the nature of his death. You have to wonder about the accuracy of these reconstructions. The most famous one is an excellent piece of work. It gets his build and coloration pretty accurate. You can see how lean he was and the hard muscles underneath the skin. Whatever he did with his time on Earth, he lived an active life, there's no doubt about that. His hair was brown and his skin colour was just like someone from the region now. Originally, his eye colour was widely reported as blue. This is because the researchers looked at his eyes, which are still there in his head, and saw that they were blue. Later genetic testing, however, concluded that his eyes were brown. Now, hair, eye and skin colour are influenced by many genes, so researchers use certain analytical techniques to come up with probability estimates for these things. In this case, the estimate suggested that his eyes were brown, and now that is widely accepted and seen in the famous reconstruction, even though the mummy's eyes look blue. Would his face have been so aged looking, with such deep lines and sagging cheeks, when he was a mere 45 years young? Well, maybe it would, yes, because of his hard life in the sun and the biting wind and the cold damaging his skin. But remember, there is also much artistic interpretation in this scientific reconstruction. Consider his hairstyle and his facial hair. Is that accurate? Well, the mummy when he was found had lost the outer layer of his skin and his hair with it, but some of his hair was found in the area, and they believe that some of it looked like beard hair. But would he have looked so scruffy? Surely people 5,200 years ago cared about their appearance just like we do today. His stripy leggings suggest there was at least some consideration of personal appearance. His clothes and belongings were nicely made, so surely he kept himself neat and tidy, And scruffy reconstructions like this are just projections of modern prejudices about our savage ancestors. Well, perhaps. Maybe his hair was neater and smarter. On the other hand, they didn't find a comb on his person, and he had probably been running for his life, so maybe he was a little unkempt at this point. What did he do throughout his life to end up with his joints so worn down and with so many aches and pains? There have been a few suggestions over the years. When they found traces of copper and arsenic in his hair, they said he must have been a metal worker. Arsenic is found in copper ores, and smelting, casting and working copper would have sent these elements into the air as poisonous vapours and tiny particles, which he would have then absorbed into his body tissues. Also, the fact that he carried a copper axe, which they say would have been a rare item at the time, marked him out as a special individual for his community. And the copper in his axe was tested and found to have come from ore mined in Tuscany. There were closer sources of copper in the Alps, but his came from much further away. So people began suggesting narratives around his life and death. Perhaps his hips and knees were so worn because he spent his life walking from community to community, plying his trade as a copper worker and copper trader. Perhaps he was even prospecting for ore sources in the mountains when he was killed. Maybe he was killed because as a wandering metal worker, he was an outsider wherever he went. And outsiders, of course, can bring danger because they can carry sickness or bad fortune with them when they arrive in your settlement. Perhaps it was a copper trade gone wrong, and someone took revenge for an economic slight and chased him up the mountain for revenge. Perhaps it even explains why his valuable copper axe was not taken by his murderer. In the Copper Age, metal workers were special, magical, and even dangerous men. The burials of metal workers in many cultures, from the Copper to the Bronze Ages, are treated differently to other people. Their tools and equipment are often buried with them in a way we don't see in other professions. Metal workers, from Britain to the steppe, often have their hammerstones, their casting moulds and pieces of their work buried with them. And these items are sometimes broken before burial, ritually killing these objects. You could say this was because these were rare and special individuals of high status, which is said of Ötzi because of his axe. But there is also something dangerous about these people and their work. They used fire to turn stone into shining copper and bronze, a supernatural and frightening process, filled with both physical and metaphysical dangers. An early metal worker would have been something more like a shaman rather than the village blacksmith of later eras, banging out horseshoes in the forge. Burials of early metal workers sometimes contain small and broken copper artifacts or pieces of them, and these were not necessarily tokens of respect for the departed. It might no longer have been safe for their owners to keep the knife or axe or copper bead that the dead man had made. And perhaps that explains why the murderer who shot Ötzi in the back with an arrow did not steal the valuable axe. Perhaps the item was spiritually tainted because it was made by this dangerous, wandering metalworker. Whatever material benefits owning one might have had, it was not worth the metaphysical risks. But there is a problem with this line of reasoning, because Ötzi probably wasn't a metalworker at all. Later tests have suggested that the copper and arsenic traces found in his hair were so faint that they could have come not from a lifetime of casting arsenical copper, but from the hairs themselves lying in contact with the surrounding rocks and ice for millennia. The local geology might have leached trace amounts of those elements into the organic material over 5,000 years. So maybe he wasn't a metalworker, but still a metaphysical tainting of the object could be a reason that the valuable axe wasn't taken by the killer. The axe itself might have been something new, potentially dangerous, and even frightening. But if he wasn't a wandering metalworker, what was he? A popular theory is that he was a shepherd, a lifetime of walking up and down the hills from summer to winter pastures, guarding the sheep with his bow and arrows, and chopping wood with his axe to keep warm through cold nights on the hills. 30 or 40 years living largely outdoors or in rough shelters on the hillside might explain his physical condition. Maybe he was killed trying to defend his flock from rustlers. They killed the shepherd, chasing him high into the mountains and shooting him in the back as he fled for the next valley. Then the murderers drove off the sheep. And something like this may well have happened. Reconstructing his last journey through analysis of the species of plants on him and in him shows that he travelled up, down and finally up again before he was killed. He also had a deep wound on his right hand across his palm, which is apparently a classic defensive wound, characteristic of someone raising their hands to block a weapon, in this case perhaps the knife or dagger of an attacker. Some sources say this injury was received 24 to 48 hours before his death. Other estimates, based on the rate of healing, put it back a week or more. It's hard to say, but the sphagnum moss inside and near his body might be related to this injury. Sphagnum moss, or bog moss, once you squeeze the water out, is very absorbent, and it also has antiseptic qualities. This stuff has been used for thousands of years to absorb the blood and to wipe the backsides of generations of our ancestors. And our Iceman here may well have grabbed a big clump of this stuff in his left hand, squeezed the water out, and then clasped it in his injured right hand over the next couple of days before he died. Then when he sat down to have his last meal, small parts of the bloody, sticky moss ended up transferring from his fingers to his stomach. What about that last meal then? What can that tell us about his life and his final hours? It is said that he died with a full stomach and that he sat down and ate a hearty meal a little while before his death. Estimates from CT scans suggest he ate a meal of about 300 grams, which is about 10.5 ounces. So assuming that is accurate, it was not a vast meal by modern standards, but a decent amount of food to eat high up on a mountainside. A widely reported early study, based on isotopic analysis of his hair, claimed that he was vegetarian or vegan. Obviously, these are modern terms and concepts related to ethical choices, so even if someone in the past did eat a plant-based diet, they could not have been a vegan as such. And perhaps a Neolithic or Copper Age person who ate only bread would make sense if you think of the Neolithic as a time when the widespread growing of domesticated wheat replaced hunting and gathering. But the Neolithic system, or rather systems, because there were many of them over the millennia, relied on domesticated animals and their products. So Neolithic people in different places and times consumed pigs, sheep and goats, cattle and dairy products in varying quantities. And some of these systems absolutely relied on the manure from their animals to grow the wheat for their bread, and on slaughtering and preserving fatted animals to get them through every winter. In fact, by the late Neolithic, many parts of Europe where there were suitable plains and grasslands had begun emphasizing cattle pastoralism rather than wheat crops. Now, if Ötzi was a shepherd, we might expect him to have eaten sheep or goat for his last dinner. But in fact, he ate ibex and red deer meat with a high fat content, along with herbs and that famous Neolithic grain, einkorn wheat, possibly in the form of bread. About half of the stomach contents was fat from the ibex, so it was a highly nutritious, energy-dense last meal. Perhaps he had pieces of ibex fat wrapped up in leaves, and he ate it along with strips of dried or smoked ibex and a piece of bread with herbs mixed into it. Sounds delicious, actually. The einkorn proportion suggests a relationship with a nearby settlement. Perhaps his wife baked him some bread to take with him on his journey. Perhaps he was given it during a trading exchange with a nearby village. Or perhaps he stole it. The ibex, though, is a wild goat that would have had to have been hunted. And that is another popular suggestion for this man's profession. He was a hunter. He used his bow to hunt ibex and shoot birds in the hills all around. And he brought them back to his settlement to supply his people with meat, furs and feathers. One of the objects he carried with him was a stone disc with a whole load of leather thongs hanging from it. This he would have attached to his belt, and these thongs would have each been used to tie around a dead bird's neck. And when he had a whole bunch of them, he could set off home. And that's why he carried so many arrows. Some people have suggested that his death was the result of a hunting accident. Perhaps he was sitting on a rock to eat his last meal, and one of his companions or someone else saw a furry figure in the distance and took a shot. The arrowhead went through his coat, it entered his back near the left shoulder, and then lacerated the left subclavian artery and caused his death from blood loss. He fell down and struck his head on a rock and bruised his body in the fall. The deadly arrow shaft was then yanked from his back, perhaps to remove the evidence, and the guilty party abandoned him to die in the snow and rocks, leaving the victim's valuable equipment behind. There have been other suggestions. Perhaps the arrowhead in his back actually belonged to him, and he slipped on the mountainside, hit his head, fell onto the arrow, and that is what killed him. Bow hunters do have similar accidents today, but in this case, I don't think that's very likely. It has been proposed that he was a human sacrifice, killed by his own people and placed on a kind of rocky altar high up in a pass to appease the gods and bring the rains this year. Again though, it doesn't seem likely to me. What about the idea that he was a warrior and that he died in battle? After all, he had signs of fights from years past and a recent defensive wound in his hand. Perhaps he was not alone and there were two groups fighting a running battle. Ötzi's side lost, but only he died in this specific place and so survived to the present. And there is an oft-repeated fact that Ötzi was found to have the blood of 4 other men on his gear, the blood of 2 men on 1 arrow, the blood of another on his knife, and the blood of a 4th on his clothing. Immediately a narrative presents itself of Ötzi the warrior stabbing one man with an arrow before shooting it into another, like Legolas shooting orcs in The Lord of the Rings, before killing a third with his knife, and then Ötzi carried away a wounded comrade on his back, trying to reach safety before being killed himself. I have repeated this fact myself in my video on the emergence of a warrior aristocracy in Bronze Age Europe. The only problem with this theory is that there was no one else's blood on his arrow, knife or clothes. Dr. Tom Loy, a respected and very scientific kind of archaeologist, publicised these claims, but unfortunately passed away before actually publishing them, and efforts to replicate his findings have failed. So perhaps the Iceman's role in his community was as a hunter, or perhaps a shepherd, or a bit of both. But what can we learn from looking closer at his wider society? What was life like in the Chalcolithic Alps? Despite his copper axe, Ötzi lived in what was essentially a Neolithic world. The Neolithic began in Europe thousands of years earlier, as populations of farmers spread from the Aegean across the continent in 2 main directions, one spreading along the Mediterranean coast and the other heading through the Balkans into Central Europe. Along the way, they interbred with the hunter-gatherers who were already there. Although the farmers with their domestic crops and animals had much larger populations, and so the overall ancestry of their descendants ended up being mostly Neolithic farmer with a smaller hunter-gatherer proportion. By 3200 BC, when Ötzi was walking the hills and valleys of northern Italy, his Neolithic farmer ancestors had already been in the region for perhaps 2,500 years, and his hunter-gatherer ancestors for thousands of years before that. Over the Neolithic period, new farming methods had been developed, allowing new environments to be exploited. It took time for people to learn how to thrive at altitude in the Alpine valleys. By adapting farming methods and raising new breeds of animals, Neolithic peoples all around the Alps moved up through the valleys at different times, some finding success and expanding, while others retreated for generations before new attempts were made. Trees in those valleys were cut down with stone axes and brush cleared by burning to create pastures and fields, changing the landscapes forever. There is a dividing line running through the Alps. The south side of the Alps drains into the Po Valley and from there into the Adriatic. The north side of the Eastern Alps drains into the Danube. Ötzi was born and raised on the southern side of this drainage divide, and he lived there too. We know this thanks to those scientific analyses, looking at the isotopes in his teeth, the pollen and other traces on his body and so on. The stone for his tools, the knife, arrowheads, a scraper, a borer and a small flake, also came from the southern side of the Alps, from the Trento Plateau and the region west of Lake Garda. This was about 100 kilometers from where he lived, because throughout the Neolithic, good quality flint and chert was sought out and traded, and stone daggers from this region have been found north of the Alps, showing contact between separate regions and the cultures that lived there. The copper for his axe came all the way from southern Tuscany, again a link to the southern side of the Alps that also shows a world of long-distance links. So his life was certainly based on this side. The high pass where Ötzi's body was found, however, was over into the north, on the Danube drainage side. We might imagine then that he had crossed over into enemy territory, into a place controlled by people with a different Central European lineage and a different way of doing things, perhaps people who spoke a different language. However, examination of the arrow that killed him shows that too was of a style from the southern side of the Alps. So who were Ötzi's people? Well, it's not necessarily a straightforward answer, Archaeological cultures are often defined by things like settlement types and house shapes and sizes, burial practices and pottery styles, none of which we have for this mummy. However, we do have his tools. So what can they tell us? His dagger is of a type broadly similar to those from the wider region, central Italy to Bavaria, and the era, the late Neolithic to Chalcolithic. But its specific type, and we're talking about very small differences in morphology, cannot be pinpointed to a specific culture. One of the arrowheads he carried is a very common type from northern Italy, also found in central Italy and Switzerland, where it often appears in Copper Age burials over the same era. This kind was so common they might have been standardized productions made specifically to be traded to other communities. The other arrowhead is a rarer and more local type, found in burials of South Tyrol and neighbouring provinces at least between 3700 to 2600 BC. His scraper is interesting. It is of a type common to a culture in the North Alps, which he presumably acquired through trade, although of course he could have acquired any of his belongings also by theft or violence. The archaeological culture of South Tyrol at this time is known as the Tamins-Carasso-Izira group, and it is thought that Ötzi was from this kind of Alpine society. However, his stone tools and copper axe also reflect the material culture of another nearby society called the Remodello culture. Most of the cultures around the Alps from this time are known from settlements, but the Remodello culture, centred on the Po plain but also reaching into the Alps, is defined mainly by its graves. The women were buried with pottery and ornaments, while the graves of the men often feature stone arrowheads, daggers and axes. And in some cases they contain copper axes just like Ötzi's. These kinds of burials are quite unusual for the Neolithic. Of course, all these objects in the male graves could be used as tools and for hunting. But some archaeologists believe the Remodello culture grave goods suggest the social role of a kind of proto-warrior had emerged in the Po Valley and the Italian Alps. Support for this proposal comes from careful analysis of Ötzi's dagger and the tool they call a scraper. Looking closely at the useware on these tools shows the scraper was in fact used by Ötzi for cutting plant fibres, perhaps cutting grasses to use as bedding material, or for making cordage, gathering herbs and so on. His dagger was perfectly suited for such things, and yet it seems he did not use it for menial tasks. Ötzi's tools were collected in a leather pouch hung from his belt, but his dagger had its own bast scabbard, suspended perhaps in front of his body. It was thus easy and quick to access, and was also highly visible to other people. These knives, then, might have primarily been weapons, and using them and carrying them would be associated with being an adult man. So daggers, bows and arrows, and copper axes, all of Ötzi's type, are associated with these possible proto-warriors of the Remodello culture. His role in life, his profession, might have been as a hunter or a herder, but his position in his community might also have been understood to include the potential to do violence. Ötzi's DNA can tell us about his ancestry and the wider genetic community he came from. His mitochondrial haplogroup shows his maternal ancestry was a unique subclade of K1. No other examples of that specific mutation have been found in ancient or modern samples, but K1 more broadly is found in other Neolithic Europeans. His Y haplogroup, which shows his paternal ancestry, that is inherited from father to son, is G, which is also found in Neolithic Europe. And genome-wide analysis matches that of the European Neolithic farmer. In other words, and unsurprisingly, his ancestry was typical for his time and place. Something like 1800 years before Ötzi's time, related cultures in the southern Balkans developed metallurgy and began casting copper tools. This technology later spread north through the Carpathians, and then further in all directions. A famous and important Neolithic culture of northern Europe, the funnel beaker culture, were importing copper and engaging in metallurgy before their way of life came to an end. Actual copper artifacts from the era are rare finds, because these items could be repeatedly and completely recycled in a way that stone tools could not. But archaeologists can radiocarbon date mining pits and slag heaps, and they can date stone moulds for casting and other metalworking tools. They can even detect heavy metal pollution from metalworking in ancient soil samples. And so we know that many of these cultures that we consider Neolithic, that is Stone Age, were in fact using copper for a long time before bronze tools and weapons became ubiquitous much later. There were other great changes occurring in Ötzi's lifetime. The earliest evidence for wheels anywhere in the world used in carts and wagons comes from Northern Europe around 3500 BC, 300 years or so earlier than Ötzi. This is evidence in the form of wheel tracks preserved in the soil beneath Neolithic tombs. And the earliest cartwheel ever found in the world comes from Slovenia, about 230 kilometers or 140 miles from where Ötzi lived, dated to about 3150 BC, a similar time to when he lived. So although it's possible Ötzi might never have seen a wheel in his life, in my opinion, he would have been totally familiar with the sight of handcarts being trundled along the valleys, loaded with firewood or grains or furs, and maybe with laughing children catching a ride. Ötzi has no direct descendants that we know of, but of course his DNA is most similar to people with high proportions of Neolithic farmer ancestry today. Southern Europeans generally have the highest proportion of Neolithic farmer ancestry, and those with the highest of all are found in Sardinia specifically. Because soon after Ötzi's lifetime, people living in the east of Europe would start moving west, across the continent all the way to the Atlantic coast. Many of the Neolithic male lines would ultimately be extinguished, and new ethnic groups would be formed, and new Indo-European languages and beliefs would take over. The archaeological culture associated with this process is known as the corded ware culture, and the earliest evidence of this in the region comes from the Swiss lakes around 3000 BC, just 200 years or so after Ötzi's death. So considering all the evidence, what actually happened to him? It was late spring or early summer. Roughly 33 hours before his death, he was at the Alpine subalpine range at about 2,500 metre elevation, on either the north or the south Alpine watershed. From there he descended to 1,200 metres above sea level on the southern side. Now, perhaps 24 hours before his death, he suffered a deep and debilitating defensive wound to his right hand. And here and now is perhaps where he suffered bruising and abrasions to his body and head, like he'd been roughed up. Whether the initial fight took place at 2,500 metres or 1,200 metres, we don't know. But he was certainly at the lower elevation when he grabbed some bog moss to grip in his injured hand. And then he spent some time at this altitude fleeing for his life along a valley floor, trying to reach home or help, or just trying to get away from his pursuers. The two arrowheads he carried on broken shafts were made by two different people. One of those people may have been Ötzi, but both arrows had been touched up by him before the injury to his hand. We can't say when their shafts were broken, but perhaps he intended to transfer these arrowheads to his other shafts, but was unable to do so because of his injured hand. The disabling hand wound might also explain why his bow shaft was unfinished. Its surface had not been smooth, and there were no notches on the ends for the bowstring, although perhaps their bows were used without notches. Maybe he lost his original bow earlier on, during some inciting incident, and he had started making a replacement, work that could not be completed after he suffered the hand injury. Maybe he was hoping to get away from his enemies for long enough to finish his bow and arrows, but he never got the chance. At some point, when he was at this lower altitude, he ate a meal, fueling himself in a quiet moment. It might have been now when he saw signs of his pursuers in the distance, tracking him along the valley. But whatever the reason, he ascended again for the last time, now going above 3,000 meters. And when he was up there, he ate again. This was between about 4 to 8 hours since his last meal. Perhaps this was his breakfast after a freezing night on the mountainside. Or perhaps it was now evening and he was exhausted from his injuries and his climb, desperate for energy. But this last meal was eaten around 4 to 5 hours before his death. Presumably, he intended to use the pass to cross to the northern side of the mountains. But before he made it, he was shot in the back by someone using an arrow from the southern Alps. Ötzi fell and died quickly, though painfully. He might have hit his head in his fall, or been struck as he lay dying. His killer or someone else yanked the arrow shaft out of his back and left this man dead or dying in the ice and rocks. Perhaps night was coming or a storm was blowing in, but they left him and his belongings there, and no one ever returned for him or his things. There are many unanswered questions, of course, like what language did he speak? It was not an Indo-European language, but more than that, we can't say. Perhaps it was related to other languages we know of from much later times, like Etruscan or Basque, but we just don't know. And we don't know why he was killed. Was Ötzi the bad guy? Was he a criminal who deserved an ignominious death? Or was he a blameless victim? Perhaps he was a hero, drawing away the enemy so his family or village could escape an attack. And we don't know if he was alone throughout his final days or if he was part of a group. Maybe there was only one attacker, or maybe there were 20 men chasing him. We don't know for sure that all the items around him were even his. All we have is the crime scene, preserved for over 5,000 years. You know, he's almost like a time traveller sent into the far future in a block of ice. Even now, he's kept frozen in special conditions at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology, which is dedicated entirely to him. But the Tyrolean Iceman continues to be periodically defrosted so that tests can be run and samples taken. The people working on him wear protective clothing and cause as little damage as possible. Yet despite their best efforts, the cycle of freeze and thaw is having an effect. Decomposition and tissue damage continue to take their toll, even as he continues to give up his secrets and continues to inspire imaginations all around the world. The series of chance events that led to his millennia of preservation were so unlikely that many of the archaeologists and scientists working on Ötzi speak of him with great reverence. More than one has called the discovery, in hushed tones, a miracle. You can understand why they feel this way. It does seem almost as if the mountains gave him up to us, as if he was a gift from the past to the present, from our ancestors to us, their descendants. And from this precious gift, we can hope to learn more in future about our Chalcolithic past. If you enjoyed this, please hit like, it really helps us out, and do subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Now please watch this video on the rise and fall of Neolithic Britain. I'm sure you'll like it. Thank you for watching.